Now let's look at a milestone in U.S. railroad history, the development of narrow-gauge railroading in the late 1800s. Along the way, we will also examine the prototype for Bachmann's large-scale 440. In the early 1860s, the American Civil War was raging. For the first time, railroads played a strategic role by providing for the efficient transportation of troops and supplies. After the war, America again focused on the development and settlement of the areas west of the Allegheny Mountains and the Mississippi River. Railroad fever gripped the nation. Every town, village, and crossroad wanted to be part of a railroad. Of course, economic reality dictated that only those areas with the potential to generate and receive substantial rail traffic could attract or afford the ribbons of rail. The Civil War also revealed many problems with the railroads, the primary one being the difficulty of operating over a variety of track gauges. Thus, there was a strong movement towards a standardized track gauge, now that the country was reunited as one nation. As the new standard gauge of 4 feet 8 1/2 inches began to take hold, there was a growing faction of railroad men interested in the construction of railroads to a narrower gauge. The reasons for this were primarily economic. Proponents argued that a narrow-gauge railroad was cheaper to construct because it required less grading and that the lighter rail and ties were less costly. The smaller engines and rolling stock were also touted as being less expensive than their standard gauge counterparts. It was advertised and promoted that a narrow-gauge railroad could be built for 1/2 the cost of a standard gauge line. Thus, areas that could not finance a standard gauge railroad might be able to raise the smaller amounts of capital necessary to construct a narrow gauge railroad. It was also argued that many standard gauge lines were underutilized and that narrow gauge railroads were more efficient, as they could carry the same amount of freight and passengers for half the cost. The argument for and against the narrow gauge raged for many years. Regardless, in 1871, narrow gauge railroad construction began to take place throughout the country. The Depression of 1873, however, slowed all railroad construction in the United States for almost 6 years. But a significant event in 1876 changed the worldview of the United States, the American Centennial Celebration of Independence. The city of Philadelphia, birthplace of the Declaration of Independence, was picked to host a huge centennial exhibition on the grounds of Fairmount Park. The exhibition was to be a showcase of American industry and culture. The international community, as well as industrialists and manufacturers from around the U.S., were invited to display their products and inventions. It was the beginning of the modern machine age, and the United States was ready to take its place as an economic, political, and military power on the world stage. The exhibition also provided an opportunity for railroad men, manufacturers, financiers, and other proponents of narrow-gauge railroading to showcase its advantages and state their case. To facilitate the movement of people throughout the exhibition grounds, a 3-foot narrow-gauge railroad was constructed. It was double-tracked for its entire 3.5-mile length and was made up almost wholly of curves and grades in order to run near all the principal buildings on the exhibition grounds. The Baldwin Locomotive Works and other locomotive manufacturers such as Danforth, Dixon, and Porter Bell supplied motive power for the West End Passenger Railway, as this little railroad came to be known. The Baldwin locomotives were a Class 818 C440 named Schuylkill and a Class 818D 260 named Delaware. Together, these two locomotives operated for 287 days of daily combined service, hauling 4 million of the exhibition's 8 million visitors over 16,000 miles. To quote Mr. R.W. Flower, Jr., the West End's general manager, in a letter to Messrs. Burnham, Parry, and Williams of the Baldwin Locomotive Works, Philadelphia,
each engine averaged fully 16 trips daily, equal to 56 miles, and as the stations were but a short distance apart, the Westinghouse air brake was applied in making 160 daily stops, or a total of 25,000 for each engine. Neither engine was out of service an hour unless from accidents for which they were in no way responsible. The
The Bachmann Spectrum narrow gauge 440 is based on a standard Baldwin catalog design from this period. Over the years, Baldwin built hundreds of similar locomotives for narrow gauge lines throughout the world. In fact, the last narrow gauge locomotive that Baldwin built in the late 1940s was a 440 for shipment to Central America. Locomotives with a 440 wheel arrangement were known as Americans. The name comes from the fact that for many years, locomotives of this type were used more than any other for nearly every variety of service throughout the United States. It offered a three-point suspension that provided for stability and flexibility on America's rough and rapidly built trackage. The 440 was quickly adopted as the universal locomotive of choice by most U.S. railroads, thus receiving the nickname American. The 440 also played a key role in the development and growth of U.S. narrow gauge railroads. Because most narrow gauge lines were lightly constructed with a minimum amount of grading, they tended to follow the contours of the ground they were crossing. The 440 American provided reliable freight and passenger service over these rough and haphazard rights-of-way. They normally ran at speeds of 15 to 20 miles per hour, but under ideal conditions were capable of 35 to 40 miles per hour. The narrow gauge boom flourished in the 1870s and 1880s as 3-foot and other gauges sprouted up around the country. However, by the early 1890s, following the financial crash of 1889, a downward trend had started. In most cases, the little roads could not operate profitably over their deteriorating and lightly built rights-of-way that now required a great deal of maintenance. In other cases, narrow gauge lines had been built to service communities that just did not have enough business to provide sufficient revenues. Where narrow gauges interchanged with standard gauge lines, the cost of transferring freight from one railroad to another proved too expensive. By the early 1900s, most of the narrow gauge was gone. Many were bought and converted to standard gauge. Those lines that did survive were railroads that either served isolated regions without any competition or provided extractive operations for a single commodity, such as coal. Some of these lines even lasted into the 1950s by upgrading their roadbed, locomotives, and equipment to resemble their bigger standard gauge cousins. The majority, however, finally succumbed during the Great Depression.